I never imagined that at 72, after 48 years of marriage, I would discover that the entire life I built next to George was a lie. When I found that receipt in his jacket pocket, a hugely expensive emerald necklace I never received, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. But what I discovered later was much worse than a simple betrayal. My husband wasn't just cheating on me with another woman. He was stealing from dozens of innocent families, diverting money that should have fed children to buy jewelry for his mistress. And at that moment, I made the hardest decision of my life. I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't make a scene. I would do something far worse. I would plan the most devastating revenge he could imagine. And when I was done, he would lose everything. Absolutely everything. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever felt your life crumble, if you've ever thought it was too late to start over, then you need to hear my story to the end, because what happened next changed not just my life, but the lives of many other women who, like me, discovered that the strength we seek is inside us all along. My fingers were trembling, holding that crumpled piece of paper I found in George's jacket pocket. It was a jeweler's receipt, dated 3 weeks ago, with a price that made my heart race. $2,400 for an emerald necklace. I stood there in the bedroom we had shared for 48 years, feeling the floor drop out from under me. I had never received that necklace. I had never seen that jewel. And George had never given me a gift that expensive in our entire married life. The smell of coffee was rising from the kitchen, mixing with the aroma of fresh sourdough bread I had baked that September morning. It was a typical Friday in Aiken, South Carolina, with the sun streaming through the windows of our house and illuminating the photographs on the wall. Records of a life I thought I knew completely. But now, with that receipt clutched between my fingers, everything felt different. Every one of those images seemed to lie to me. Every captured smile seemed false. I went downstairs slowly, holding the receipt hidden in my palm. George was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the Wall Street Journal, as he did every morning before heading to the Fishermen's Credit Union, where he worked as the CFO. He was 58, with neatly combed gray hair, reading glasses resting on the tip of his nose. The same man I had known since I was 24, when we got married at the First Baptist Church downtown. Or at least, that's what I thought. I poured his coffee in silence, watching his every move, every expression. He thanked me without taking his eyes off the newspaper, completely oblivious to the earthquake happening inside me. My Native American grandmother, who raised me after my mother had to leave, always said I inherited her ability to observe in silence, to keep the storms locked inside my chest until the right moment to let them out. In that instant, I was grateful for that trait. I didn't say a word. I didn't ask about the receipt. Something inside me, that same intuition that used to wake me up minutes before the Appalachian thunderstorms arrived, told me there was much more hidden in that story. If I confronted George now, he would invent some excuse, and I would lose the chance to discover the whole truth. After he left for work, I sat on the porch of our bed and breakfast and let the tears fall. Our small family-run B&B was located near the marina, a simple yet welcoming place that I had turned into a local landmark over the years. Tourists came to visit the Savannah River attractions and ended up staying here, enchanted by my hospitality and the sweet potato biscuits I served for breakfast. It was my pride, my refuge, the result of decades of hard work. I had given up so much for that man. When I was young, I dreamed of studying nursing, having a career, being more than just someone's wife. But George needed support to build his career at the credit union, and someone needed to take care of the house, the business. So I tucked my dreams away in a drawer and dedicated myself to being the best wife possible. And now I discovered that perhaps it had all been for nothing. The following days were silent torture. I continued to wake up early, prepare breakfast for the guests, clean the rooms, smiling for everyone while my world crumbled inside. But I started watching George differently. I noticed things that had previously gone unnoticed. The way he smiled at his cell phone when he thought I wasn't looking. The calls he answered by stepping out of the room. The extra meetings at the credit union on Thursdays. Always at the same time. Always with the same excuse that he needed to close the monthly balance sheets. The following Tuesday, while tidying the bedroom, I found another receipt. This time from an expensive restaurant in Charleston, the capital, where George had supposedly gone to handle credit union business the month before. The receipt showed 2 meals, 2 glasses of wine, a shared dessert. I felt a physical pain in my chest, as if someone was squeezing my heart with their hands. I needed to find out who she was. I needed to see the face of the woman who was stealing my husband, destroying my life, staining 48 years of dedication. The opportunity came on Thursday when George announced he would have another one of those late meetings at the credit union. I waited for him to leave, and for the first time in almost 5 decades of marriage, I followed my own husband through the streets of Aiken. He didn't go to the credit union. He drove to a small restaurant downtown, parked the car, and went inside. I stayed across the street, hidden behind a farmer's market stand, feeling my whole body tremble. 15 minutes later, a woman arrived. She was young, must have been about 30. Long dark hair, a tight red dress, beautiful, very beautiful, and wearing an emerald necklace that sparkled even from a distance. The world spun around me. I grabbed the edge of the market stand counter to keep from falling. The vendor asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I just watched that woman walk into the restaurant, watched through the window as George stood up to greet her, how he held her hand for a few seconds longer than necessary, how he pulled out her chair, a chivalry that had been missing with me for years. I walked back home, even though I had driven the car. I needed the fresh air. I needed to process everything. I arrived at the B&B close to midnight. George still hadn't returned. I sat in the kitchen, in the dark, waiting. When he finally arrived, shortly after 1 in the morning, he invented an elaborate excuse about problems with the balance sheets, about documents that urgently needed review. I looked at him and realized I didn't know that man anymore. Or maybe I had never truly known him. I nodded, said I understood, offered to warm up his dinner. He refused, saying he had eaten something at the credit union. One more lie to add to the growing collection. That night, lying next to him in bed, listening to his quiet breathing as he slept, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't cry, beg, or make a scene. I would do something far worse. I would uncover every detail of that betrayal. I would gather every proof, every piece of evidence. And when I had everything in my hands, I would destroy not just his relationship with that woman, but the entire life he had built upon my back. The next morning I woke up before dawn and started planning. The regional tourism fair would take place the following week, an event that gathered all the hospitality business owners in the area. I always participated, presenting our B&B, making contacts, promoting our work. And if that woman worked in the industry, as I suspected from her sophisticated attire, she would be there too. I spent the next few days preparing, choosing the right clothes, rehearsing casual conversations, arming myself with courage. George suspected nothing. He continued his routine of lies, his Thursday outings, his false smiles, and I continued serving coffee, baking biscuits, being the perfect wife I had always been. The day of the fair arrived sunny and hot, typical of September in South Carolina. The event was held at the City Convention Center, with dozens of booths representing hotels, B&Bs, and tourism agencies. I carefully set up my booth, displaying photos of the B&B, folders with information, samples of my sweet potato biscuits that were always a hit. I was talking to a potential client when I saw her. She was 3 booths away, smiling professionally at visitors, wearing an elegant blue dress and the damned emerald necklace. My stomach churned, but I maintained my composure. I waited for the right moment when fewer people were circulating and approached her booth. The name was written in large letters on the front of the booth, the Grand View Hotel, and below, in smaller letters, her name, Dawn Foster, Public Relations Manager. I took a deep breath and entered her booth with my best smile, introducing myself as the owner of a local B&B interested in forming partnerships for mutual client referrals. Dawn was extremely friendly, professional, and charming. We talked for almost 20 minutes about the tourism market, the difficulties of competing with large hotels, and marketing strategies. She was 34, I discovered during the conversation, had a degree in hotel administration, and had been working in the industry for 10 years. She seemed genuinely interested in establishing a business partnership. That's when George appeared. He was visiting the fair, as he did every year to represent the Fishermen's Credit Union, that also depended on tourism. I saw his face turn pale when he found me there, talking to Dawn. But he recovered quickly, too professional to show discomfort in public. He greeted both of us politely, pretending to only know Dawn by sight, as just another business owner in the industry. But I saw it. I saw the quick glance they exchanged, the slight blush that rose to her face, the way his fingers momentarily clenched. And in that moment, with the three of us standing there feigning normalcy, I felt every muscle in my body tense with a cold, calculated rage. George invented some excuse and quickly walked away. Dawn continued talking to me as if nothing had happened, but I noticed the subtle change in her demeanor, a tension that wasn't there before. I exchanged contact information with her, promising to call the following week to discuss partnership details, and walked back to my booth with shaky legs but a clear mind. Now I had a name, a face, a workplace. Now the hunt could truly begin. In the following days, I started investigating discreetly. I asked acquaintances about the Grand View Hotel, about the public relations manager. The information arrived piece by piece, and each one was like a punch to the stomach. Dawn was known for her ambition, her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, for always keeping an eye on opportunities to climb the social ladder. A week after the fair, during a casual conversation with one of the maids who worked at the B&B, I discovered something that chilled my blood. The maid's niece worked at the Grand View Hotel, and had mentioned that Dawn was constantly receiving expensive gifts from a secret admirer. Jewelry, flowers, dinners at upscale restaurants. The description of the admirer perfectly matched George. That night when George came home, I observed his every detail with new eyes. The expensive shirt I didn't remember seeing before. The different, more sophisticated cologne. The wedding ring he now took off before going out on Thursdays, thinking I didn't notice. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told me? How many nights had he slept next to me after being in her arms? The questions gnawed at me, but I maintained my silence, because I was beginning to realize that this betrayal was just the tip of something much bigger, and before I acted, I needed to discover the whole truth. In my nightstand drawer, I began collecting every piece of evidence I found. Receipts, discreetly taken photographs, notes of dates and times, a silent dossier on the destruction of my marriage. It was during a routine cleaning of George's office, the small back room he used for work, that I found something that changed everything. At the bottom of a locked drawer, the key to which was hidden behind a picture frame, there was a folder with financial documents, bank statements for an account I didn't know about. An account in the credit union's name, but with strange movements. Regular deposits, always at the end of the month, always in small amounts that didn't draw attention individually, but which, added up over 4 years, amounted to a fortune. I sat in the office chair, leafing through those documents with trembling hands. George wasn't just cheating on me with another woman. He was embezzling money from the credit union, stealing from the fishermen who trusted him, building a future at the expense of hard-working, honest people. And most likely that money was financing the expensive gifts for Dawn, the romantic dinners, that whole farce. The phone rang, making me jump out of the chair, startled. It was a guest asking for extra towels. I answered mechanically, put the documents back in the drawer, locked everything back up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Now it was no longer just about marital infidelity. It was about financial crime, about abuse of trust, about dozens of families who depended on that money to survive. That night, after George fell asleep, I went back to the office. I photographed every document, every statement, every proof of transaction. I needed concrete evidence before making any move. The next morning, when he left for work, I called Janice, the credit union's treasurer. She was 68, had been my friend for decades, a woman of unshakable honesty, whom I always admired. We arranged to meet for coffee the following afternoon at a discreet bakery away from downtown. Janice arrived punctually, as always, with her notebook under her arm, and that gentle smile that lit up her face. We talked about pleasantries for a few minutes, until, with my heart in my throat, I asked if she had noticed anything strange in the credit union's balance sheets in recent years. Her expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared, replaced by a deep concern. She looked around, making sure no one was listening, and then whispered that, yes, she had noticed some irregularities. Nothing too obvious, just small inconsistencies that George always explained with convincing technical arguments. But she had her suspicions, kept silent out of respect, and because she had no concrete evidence. When I showed her the photographs of the bank statements on my phone, I saw the blood drain from Janice's face. She gripped my hand across the table, squeezing hard, and her eyes filled with tears. Those fishermen were her family, her community. George was stealing not just money, but their future, the security of their children, the sustenance of their homes. We left that coffee shop with a plan. Janice would discreetly begin investigating the credit union's records, looking for more evidence. I would continue documenting everything related to the personal betrayal, and when we had enough proof, we would expose George completely, destroying not just his marriage, but the entire life of lies he had built. The following weeks were the hardest of my life, continuing to live in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, pretending nothing was happening, while inside I burned with rage and pain. October arrived, bringing the annual Heritage Festival, one of the city's biggest celebrations. George insisted that I stay at the B&B taking care of the guests, while he went to represent the credit union at the event. I agreed without question, but I followed him again. I saw when he met Dawn in a discreet corner of the festival, away from curious eyes. I saw when he intertwined his fingers with hers, when he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. I saw when he handed her a small package that probably contained another expensive piece of jewelry bought with stolen money, and I felt something inside me definitively break, but also harden, transforming into something cold and relentless. The next day, Janice called me asking to meet urgently. When I arrived at her house, I found my friend visibly shaken, surrounded by papers spread across the kitchen table. She had spent the entire night reviewing the credit union's old files, and what she discovered was even worse than we imagined. The embezzlements were not just regular. They had progressively increased over the last 4 years, coinciding exactly with the start of George's relationship with Dawn. We sat together in that kitchen, 2 women over 60, who always believed they were doing the right thing, and planned the most meticulous revenge I could imagine. It wouldn't just be exposing George publicly. It would be methodically destroying every pillar of his life, making him lose everything in the same way he had made me lose my trust, my peace, my 48 years of dedication. But then something happened that I didn't expect. A week later, during a routine doctor's visit for a checkup, I discovered something about my own health that threw all my certainties into the air again. Sitting in that office, listening to Dr. Peterson's words echo in the room, I realized that perhaps the time for my revenge was much shorter than I imagined, and that I needed to act soon, much faster than planned. Dr. Peterson's words still echoed in my head when I left the office that October afternoon. High blood pressure, alarming stress levels, signs of physical and emotional exhaustion that could trigger serious heart problems if I didn't change my routine immediately. He recommended rest, medication, psychological counseling. But how could I rest when my whole life was falling apart? How could I lower my stress while living daily with the man who was betraying me and stealing from innocent people? I sat on the park bench across from the office, watching the dark waters of the Savannah River in the distance. I was 72, had dedicated almost 5 decades of my life to a marriage I discovered was a farce, and now my own body was paying the price for so much silent suffering. The irony was cruel. George was destroying not just my trust and my heart, but also my health, literally killing me slowly, without even knowing it. I took out my cell phone and called Janice. I needed to tell someone. I needed to share that burden. She answered on the second ring, and when she heard my choked voice, she said she was coming to pick me up immediately. 15 minutes later, we were sitting in her car, parked near the marina, and I finally let the tears fall freely as I told her about the diagnosis. Janice held my hands tightly, her eyes also teary. She said something that was etched into my soul at that moment. She said I couldn't let George destroy me completely, that he had already taken too much from me, and that now I needed to take care of my health before anything else. But I knew I wouldn't be able to recover living that lie. I needed to end it, and I needed to do it quickly. That night I took the first dose of the blood pressure medicine and lay next to George, feeling an immense emptiness in my chest. He slept peacefully, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was literally falling ill because of him. I watched his face in the darkness of the room, that face I thought I knew so well, and wondered at what exact moment he had stopped loving me. Or had he never truly loved me? The following days brought a change in me. The fragility I felt in Dr. Peterson's office was gradually replaced by a fierce determination. If my time was running out, if my health was compromised, then I would use every ounce of energy I had left to ensure George paid for everything he had done. No longer just for revenge, but for justice. For the dozens of families he was stealing from. For the woman I was and whom he helped destroy. I began to better organize my evidence. I created folders on the computer, separated documents by category, put together a detailed timeline of the financial embezzlements and the lies about his whereabouts. Janice helped me whenever she could, bringing more information from the credit union, confirming my suspicions with concrete data. We were building a solid, irrefutable case. It was during this deeper investigation that I discovered something that shocked me even more. George wasn't just embezzling money from the credit union. He was falsifying financial reports, creating non-existent expenses, manipulating records in such a sophisticated way that only someone with deep technical knowledge could identify the irregularities. This wasn't a moral lapse. It was an elaborate and premeditated scheme. In mid-November, during a casual conversation with one of my longest-staying guests, a lady from Atlanta who came to the B&B every year, I discovered something about Dawn that completely changed my perspective on the situation. The guest worked in real estate in the capital and knew Dawn's husband. Yes, husband. Dawn was married to a businessman named Richard Rich Taylor, owner of a chain of gas stations across Georgia. I felt the world spin around me when I heard that information. George was being deceived in the same way he was deceiving me. Dawn maintained 2 parallel lives, an apparently stable marriage in the capital, and an affair in Aiken. That was simultaneously satisfying and painful. Satisfying because it meant George was as foolish and naive as I had been. Painful because it revealed that we were both victims of a manipulative woman who used people as pawns in a game of self-interest. I spent the next few days obsessed with finding out more about Rich Taylor. I searched online, discreetly asked acquaintances in Atlanta, put together a complete profile of him. He was 45, a successful businessman, respected in the capital's business community, and apparently had no idea that his wife was having an extramarital affair in another city. That's when I had an idea that seemed brilliant and terrible at the same time. What if I contacted Rich? What if I revealed Dawn's betrayal to him? That wouldn't just destroy her relationship with George, but her entire life. It would be a perfect revenge against the woman who helped destroy my marriage, even if she didn't know I existed. But before making any rash decisions, I needed more proof. I needed photographs, witnesses, concrete evidence that left no room for doubt or excuses. I discreetly hired an acquaintance who worked with event photography, a discreet woman named Naomi, who was 56 and needed extra money. I explained the situation briefly, just saying I suspected my husband was having an affair and needed proof for the divorce. Naomi accepted the job without asking many questions. Over the next 3 weeks, she discreetly followed George and Dawn, capturing intimate moments in restaurants, furtive meetings in parking lots, long embraces in dark corners. Every photograph she showed me was like a stab in the heart, but I stored everything methodically, adding to the dossier that grew day by day. The city's anniversary festival was approaching, and with it, a perfect opportunity. George announced that we needed to talk seriously about the future of the B&B. He sat with me on the porch one rainy November afternoon, and with a falsely concerned expression, said that the tourism market was very weak, and that maybe we should consider selling the business. I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even myself. I asked if he was sure, if he had analyzed the numbers well. George insisted yes, he was being realistic, that we couldn't afford to keep a business that wasn't making a profit. The lie was so blatant that I had to bite my tongue to keep from exploding. Our occupancy was at 90%. We had reservations until March of the following year. The profit had never been better. But I immediately understood what he was planning. He wanted to sell the B&B, take the money, and start a new life with Dawn. He probably had everything calculated already, knew how much we were worth, already had plans on how to divide the assets. He just wasn't counting on one thing. I already knew everything, and I was 10 steps ahead of him. I agreed to think about the proposal, said I needed a few days to process the idea. George seemed relieved, probably thinking I would be the compliant wife as always, accepting his decisions without question. How wrong he was. The next day, I looked up Manny Bittencourt, a 61-year-old lawyer who had frequented the B&B for over a decade. Manny was known in the region for his discretion and efficiency, specializing in family law cases and also financial fraud. I scheduled a consultation at his office, bringing with me all the evidence I had collected in recent months. When I spread the documents on his table, the photographs, the bank statements, the detailed notes, I watched Manny's eyes progressively widen. He spent over 2 hours analyzing every document, asking questions, taking notes. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious and determined. Manny said I had in my hands not just a solid divorce case, with total separation of assets in my favor, but also enough evidence to prosecute George for embezzlement of funds and breach of fiduciary trust. He could lose not just his marriage, but also his professional license, his reputation, and possibly even face criminal consequences if the credit union members decided to press charges. But Manny had an even better suggestion. Instead of simply exposing George publicly, and running the risk of him destroying evidence or fleeing, we should orchestrate a controlled situation where he would be confronted in front of important witnesses. A situation from which he could not escape, where there was no room for lies or excuses. The idea began to take shape in my head. The end-of-year holiday party. Every year I hosted a dinner at the B&B for the main business partners, local authorities, and close friends. It was a tradition, an event everyone looked forward to. This year, that dinner would have a very different purpose than usual. Manny loved the idea. He suggested we invite not just people from our social circle, but also the main members of the credit union, including Ted Harrison, the 65-year-old Chamber of Commerce president, who was extremely respected in the community. Ted's presence would lend weight and seriousness to the confrontation, transforming it from a personal drama into a matter of community justice. But there was an even more important element in Manny's plan. He suggested we try to contact Rich Taylor, Dawn's husband. If we could get him to Aiken on the night of the dinner, we would have not only the exposure of George's betrayal, but also the revelation of Dawn's duplicity. It would be the complete collapse of the 2 lives of lies they had built. The idea was risky, but perfect. Manny offered to make the initial contact with Rich, using the excuse of being a lawyer investigating financial irregularities involving his wife. It would be a careful approach, revealing information gradually, building trust until the moment to reveal the full truth about Dawn's relationship with George. I left Manny's office that afternoon feeling a mix of fear and excitement. The plan was in motion. The pieces were being positioned on the board. Now it was just a matter of time and perfect execution. December was fast approaching, and with it, the moment of my revenge. In the following days, I began preparations for the dinner with a dedication that surprised even myself. I made the guest list, chose the menu, organized every detail. George commented that I was particularly excited about the holiday party this year, and I agreed with a smile, saying I had a feeling it would be an unforgettable night. He had no idea how accurate that statement was. Manny called me a week later with news. He had managed to contact Rich Taylor, and as we expected, the businessman had no idea about his wife's meetings in Aiken. Manny had presented the photographic evidence gradually, and Rich, after the initial shock, agreed to come to the city on the day of the dinner. He wanted to confront Dawn personally. He wanted to see with his own eyes the extent of the betrayal. Everything was falling perfectly into place, but I still needed to deal with an immediate problem. My health remained fragile, and the stress of planning that elaborate revenge was taking its toll. I had 2 high blood pressure episodes in 1 week, and Dr. Peterson threatened to admit me if I didn't drastically slow down. But how could I stop now, when I was so close? I promised the doctor that after the end-of-year dinner I would take a vacation, rest, focus on my recovery. He didn't seem convinced, but agreed to continue monitoring my situation with weekly appointments and medication adjustments. The weeks passed in a fog of preparations and anxiety. George continued his lies, his Thursday outings, his false smiles. Dawn continued wearing the expensive jewelry he bought with stolen money, and I continued smiling, serving coffee, pretending everything was fine, while inside I counted the days until the moment of truth. Until finally the first week of December arrived, and with it, the date set for the dinner. Manny confirmed that Rich would be in Aiken on the night of the event, discreetly staying at a different hotel from Dawn to avoid any chance of a premature encounter. Ted confirmed his presence, as did Janice and other important credit union members. Everything was ready. On the morning of the dinner, I woke up before dawn, with my heart pounding. I took my blood pressure medicine, took several deep breaths, and asked for strength from my grandmother, who was no longer here. Today was the day when 48 years of lies would be exposed. Today was the day George would discover that the quiet, compliant wife he thought he knew was, in fact, much stronger and more determined than he ever imagined. Today was the day my life, one way or another, would change forever. The B&B had never looked so beautiful as it did on that December night. I spent the entire day preparing every detail, setting the tables in the main hall with white tablecloths and arrangements of magnolia flowers, preparing the typical dishes that were always a hit. George commented several times on how elaborate I was being, and every compliment from him was like poison in my mouth. If he knew what was really coming, he probably would have fled out the back door. The guests began arriving around 7 in the evening. Ted Harrison was one of the first, impeccable in his gray suit, greeting everyone with that natural authority of someone who had commanded the Chamber of Commerce for over 20 years. Janice arrived soon after, and when our eyes met, I saw in them the same mixture of anxiety and determination that I felt. She knew what was about to happen, and was ready to bear witness. George circulated through the room as he always did, the perfect host, talking business, laughing at jokes, completely at ease. He wore his best suit, was freshly shaved and perfumed, the image of respectability. Looking at him at that moment, it was impossible to imagine the monster hiding behind that impeccable facade. But I knew, and soon everyone there would know too. Manny arrived promptly at 7:30, carrying a leather briefcase that I knew was full of compromising documents. He greeted me with a discreet handshake, a gesture that meant everything was ready, that Rich was waiting in the kitchen for the agreed-upon moment to make his entrance. My heart was pounding so hard, I feared everyone could hear it. We served appetizers first, shrimp fritters, sweet potato patties, stuffed deviled eggs. The guests praised the food, the decor, the cozy atmosphere. George approached me at one point, put his arm around my waist, and quietly said that I was radiant, that he was lucky to have such a dedicated wife. I had to summon all my willpower not to push him away at that instant. At 8 o'clock, when everyone was settled at the tables, I served the main course. Smoked ham with collard greens, rice with pecans, cornbread stuffing. The conversation flowed animatedly. Laughter echoed through the hall. It was the calm before the storm, and only I and my accomplices knew it. It was after we finished dessert that I decided to begin the plan. I stood up from the table, picked up a spoon, and gently tapped the wine glass, drawing everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted. All eyes turned to me. George looked at me curiously, still without the slightest suspicion of what was coming. I thanked everyone for their presence, talked about how important it was to have true friends, honest people around us. I said that this dinner had a special purpose this year, that there were some truths that needed to be revealed. I saw George's expression begin to change, a wrinkle of worry emerging between his eyebrows. I gestured to Manny, who stood up and began distributing copies of the documents we had prepared. Bank statements, financial reports, records of suspicious movements. I calmly explained that in recent weeks I had discovered serious irregularities in the Fishermen's Credit Union's accounts, systematic embezzlements that had been happening for at least 4 years. The silence that settled in the hall was deafening. I saw Ted leaf through the documents with an increasingly serious expression. Janice confirmed that, as treasurer, she had noticed the inconsistencies but had always received convincing explanations from the responsible CFO. And then I looked directly at George and said his name out loud, clear, and firm. The color drained from his face. He tried to stand up to stammer out some explanation. But Manny was already presenting more evidence. Proof of transfers to a personal account, records of falsified expenses, a trail of lies so extensive it would be impossible to deny. George looked around, seeking support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces. It was then that I decided to go deeper. I said that the financial irregularities were only part of the story, that another equally serious betrayal was happening, I picked up the envelope hidden beneath my chair and began spreading the photographs on the table. George and Dawn in restaurants. George and Dawn walking hand in hand. George giving that hugely expensive emerald necklace to her. I heard muffled exclamations around the room. Some women covered their mouths. Ted closed his eyes for a moment, as if feeling physical pain at the revelation. George was completely white now, his hands visibly trembling on the table, unable to formulate any defense. But I wasn't finished yet. I looked at Manny and gave the agreed-upon signal. He discreetly left towards the kitchen, and a few seconds later returned, accompanied by a man most people there didn't know. Rich Taylor entered the hall with firm steps, his face marked by controlled rage, his eyes fixed on the photographs scattered on the table. I introduced Rich to those present. I explained that he was a businessman from Atlanta, owner of a chain of gas stations, and more importantly, Dawn Foster's husband. The woman who appeared in those intimate photographs, with my husband. The woman who wore the emerald necklace bought with money, embezzled from the credit union. The woman who had built a double life, deceiving two men at the same time. George's reaction was devastating. He literally staggered in his chair, gripping the edge of the table to keep from falling. He looked at me with an expression of absolute shock, then at Rich, then back at the photographs. He stammered that he didn't know, that Dawn had said she was single, that she never mentioned being married. The pathetic attempt to play the victim sounded hollow in the silent hall. Rich asked to speak. With a controlled voice yet heavy with emotion, he recounted that he had been married to Dawn for 8 years, that he completely trusted her, that she frequently traveled to Aiken supposedly for work. He said Manny had contacted him 2 weeks prior, presenting evidence of the extramarital relationship, and that he initially didn't want to believe it. But the proof was irrefutable. Ted finally spoke, his deep voice echoing through the hall. He said that what we were witnessing was the complete breach of trust that sustained our community, that the credit union's fishermen worked hard to support their families, and that their money had been stolen to finance an extramarital affair. That this was not just immoral, it was criminal. George tried to defend himself, invented excuses about financial pressures, about moments of weakness, about having made mistakes he intended to correct. But every word that came out of his mouth sounded emptier than the last. Manny then presented the final document, a complete compilation of all the embezzlements, totaling over $150,000 over 4 years. The amount shocked everyone. $150,000 that should have been invested in improvements for the credit union, in supporting the fishermen's families, in community development, all diverted to sustain a relationship based on lies and expensive jewelry. Janice was silently crying, and several other credit union members present had expressions of anger and betrayal on their faces. It was then that something happened I didn't expect. One of the fishermen present, an elderly man named Walter, who was 73 and a father of 5 children, stood up trembling with rage. He pointed his finger at George and said that his youngest son had dropped out of college the year before because the family couldn't afford the tuition, that they had counted on the credit union's support, but the money never arrived because it was being stolen. Other voices began to rise. A woman recounted that her fisherman husband had suffered an accident and needed medical assistance that the credit union should have provided, but the funds were insufficient. Another man spoke about fishing equipment that was never purchased despite being approved in the budget. Every story was a stab at what little dignity George had left. I tried to maintain my composure, but seeing the real suffering that George's actions had caused was more painful than I had imagined. This was no longer about my personal revenge. It was about justice for dozens of families who trusted the wrong man. I felt my blood pressure rise. My vision became slightly blurry, but I took a deep breath and focused. I couldn't pass out now, not when I was so close to concluding everything. Ted took control of the situation. He announced that an extraordinary meeting of the credit union would be called for the following week, that George was immediately suspended from all his duties, and that the competent authorities would be notified about the embezzlements. Manny confirmed that he had already prepared all the necessary documentation for the legal proceedings. But one crucial element was still missing. I asked aloud where Dawn was, why she wasn't present at this dinner since all the main tourism business owners had been invited. The question hung in the air for a few seconds until Rich answered with chilling coldness. He said his wife was at that very moment at the Grand View Hotel, waiting for a call from him confirming his arrival in Atlanta. But instead she would receive a very different visit. Rich explained that he had hired a lawyer in Atlanta who was at that moment personally serving Dawn with the divorce papers, presenting all the evidence of the betrayal, that she would be confronted with the photographs, with the testimonials, with the complete truth about how her life of lies had been exposed, and that besides losing her marriage, she would likely lose her job when the hotel owner discovered the scandal. The information brought a bitter satisfaction. Dawn was at that moment discovering that her world was collapsing, just as mine had collapsed months ago when I found that receipt. The difference was that she deserved every second of that pain, while I had been merely an innocent victim of her manipulations. George finally broke down. He literally slumped in the chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I don't know if they were tears of genuine remorse or just self-pity for having been caught. At that moment, I no longer cared. I looked at that broken man and felt only an immense void where there had once been love, trust, decades of shared history. Ted ended the dinner, asking everyone to leave, and let George reflect on his actions. The guests left in silence, some stopping to shake my hand, others to whisper words of support. Janice hugged me tightly before leaving, saying I had been very brave, that I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for the whole community. When the last guest left, it was just me, George, and Manny in the hall. The lawyer asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I said I was fine, that I wanted to finish this. Manny then handed George the divorce papers, explaining that I was requesting total separation of assets, with exclusive ownership of the B&B, considering it had always been built and maintained primarily with my work. George looked at the papers without really seeing them. Then he finally lifted his face and stared at me. His eyes were red, his face devastated. He asked in a low, hoarse voice how long I had known, how long I had been planning all of this. I answered calmly that I had known for months, ever since I found the receipt for the emerald necklace, that I had investigated every lie, documented every betrayal, meticulously prepared this moment. He asked if I hated him. The question caught me off guard. I stayed silent for a few seconds, searching for the honest answer within me. Finally, I said no. I didn't hate him. That maybe it would be easier if I did. But what I felt was a deep disappointment and an immense void. That he had destroyed 48 years of my life, had literally made me ill, had stolen not just from me but from dozens of innocent families, and that now he would have to live with the consequences of his choices. Manny intervened, saying George had 24 hours to leave the house and the B&B, that all his personal belongings would be separated and made available for pickup, but that he no longer had the right to stay there. George nodded, defeated, and staggered to his feet. He stopped at the door of the hall, looked back one last time, as if he wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. He just walked out, and I heard his heavy steps climbing the stairs towards the bedroom that would no longer be his. When I was finally alone in the hall, surrounded by the remnants of the dinner that had changed my life forever, I felt my legs weaken. I sat down in one of the chairs, rested my elbows on the table, and let out everything I had held in for hours. I cried for the woman I was, for the marriage I thought I had, for the years wasted on a lie, but I also cried with relief, because finally the truth had come out, and I could start rebuilding my life away from that man who had betrayed me in every possible way. The next morning dawned gray and rainy, as if the sky shared the weight I carried in my chest. I woke up on the living room sofa, where I had fallen asleep from exhaustion after cleaning up the dinner hall. My whole body ached, my head pounded, and when I took my blood pressure with the device Dr. Peterson had given me, the number was alarmingly high. I took a double dose of the medicine and sat breathing deeply, trying to calm the heart that insisted on racing. George was no longer in the house. I went up to the bedroom we had shared for so many years and found his closet empty, his toothbrush gone from the bathroom, just a few forgotten hangers like ghosts of a life that no longer existed. He had left during the night, silently, like a thief, fleeing the crime scene. The irony was not lost on me. Janice appeared around 9 in the morning, bringing fresh sourdough and a tight hug that almost made me break down again. We sat in the kitchen while the rain drummed on the windows, and she told me that news of the scandal had already spread throughout the entire town. Aiken wasn't big, and within hours everyone knew about the embezzlements at the credit union, the betrayal, the dramatic confrontation at the dinner. The reactions were varied, Janice said. Some expressed shock and disbelief, unable to believe that George, always so respected, could have done that. Others said they had always suspected something, that there were signs they chose to ignore, and there were those who openly supported me, saying I had been brave to expose the truth, even if it meant destroying my own marriage. But what touched me most was knowing that several women in the community had called Janice that morning, wanting to know how I was, offering help, sharing their own stories of betrayal and overcoming. I discovered that I wasn't alone in that pain, that many others had gone through similar situations and found the strength to rebuild their lives. That gave me a fragile but real hope. The following days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional events. Manny took care of all the divorce paperwork, and since George had no way to contest the evidence, the process moved quickly. The extraordinary meeting of the credit union happened the following Wednesday, and Ted invited me to participate as the main witness. The credit union hall was packed. Fishermen and their families, community members, even some local journalists who wanted to cover the scandal. When I walked in, many stood up in a gesture of respect that brought tears to my eyes. Walter, the elderly fisherman whose son had dropped out of college, came up to me and held my hands, thanking me for having the courage to expose the truth. The meeting was painful but necessary. Janice presented the complete numbers of the embezzlements, demonstrating point by point how George had manipulated the records over 4 years. The total was even higher than we had initially calculated, reaching almost $200,000 when all suspicious transactions were included. The room erupted in indignant murmurs. Ted announced that the credit union would file a lawsuit against George, demanding the full restitution of the embezzled amounts, plus interest and damages. Manny, who was present as my legal representative, confirmed that George would have to sell his personal assets to start paying the debt, and that, even so, it would take years to pay it all off. I discovered at that meeting that George had rented a small apartment in the town's furthest neighborhood, near the bus station. He was hiding, too ashamed to appear in public, having lost not only his job at the credit union, but also any chance of working as an CFO in the area again. His name was irreversibly stained. As for Dawn, the news that arrived from Atlanta was equally devastating for her. Rich had proceeded with the divorce, and the scandal had reached the ears of the Grand View hotel owner. She was summarily fired, losing not only her job, but also the reputation she had built in the hotel market. I heard she tried to contact George several times, but he refused all calls, finally realizing he had been used. Returning to the B&B after the meeting, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out. Justice was being served, and I had the support of the community. But I also felt a frightening emptiness. 48 years of my life had been erased in one night, and now I needed to discover who Carla was, without being George's wife. The following weeks brought a strange new routine. I woke up alone, had coffee alone, managed the B&B alone. At first, the loneliness was suffocating. Every corner of the house reminded me of George, of our life together, of the lies I had believed were truths. Several times I caught myself turning to comment on something to him, only to remember he wasn't there anymore. But gradually, I began to discover small freedoms I had long forgotten. I could watch my favorite shows on television without having to negotiate. I could rearrange the house the way I had always wanted, but he never allowed. I could make decisions about the B&B without consulting anyone. They were small but significant freedoms. Janice became my constant companion. She had retired from the credit union after the scandal, tired of decades working with numbers and reports. One day, having coffee on the porch of the B&B, she casually commented that she had always dreamed of working in tourism, meeting new people, being part of something more dynamic. I looked at her and saw an opportunity not just for me, but for both of us. I proposed a partnership. Janice would join as a partner in the B&B, investing her retirement savings in exchange for 50% of the business. She would be responsible for the administrative and financial side, something she did masterfully, while I would continue taking care of the operational side and guest services. It would be a partnership between two women who had survived life's storms and were ready to rebuild. Janice accepted immediately, with tears in her eyes. She said she had never had a friend like me, someone who trusted her enough to share a business. We closed the deal with Manny the next day, formalizing the partnership. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine flash of happiness. The B&B was no longer just mine, but ours, and somehow that made everything feel less lonely. We started making changes immediately. We renovated 2 rooms that had needed attention for years. We hired a young woman named Frances to help with cleaning and breakfast, a 22-year-old who had just lost her job at a restaurant and desperately needed work. We created new tour packages in partnership with local agencies. The B&B began to take on a new life, but while professional life flourished, my health remained a constant concern. The high blood pressure episodes became more frequent, and Dr. Peterson was clear with me in a particularly difficult appointment in January. He said my heart had suffered a lot of stress in recent months, that I needed to drastically slow down or risk something more serious. He recommended that I delegate more tasks, rest more, even consider spending a few days away from the B&B. The idea of stepping away seemed impossible at first. The B&B was my refuge, my purpose, what kept me going. But Janice insisted, saying that was exactly why she was there, to share the burden, that I needed to trust her and take care of my health before it was too late. That's how, in February, for the first time in decades, I took a week off. Frances suggested I visit her family in a small Appalachian mountain community, further up the Savannah River, a quiet place where I could rest away from everything. I accepted the suggestion half reluctantly, half hopeful that perhaps a little distance would do me good. The community was tiny, just 30 families living in cabins on the banks of the river, sustained by fishing and subsistence farming. The simplicity of the place was comforting. There was no internet. Television only worked sporadically, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the rising and setting sun. I stayed at Frances's grandmother's house, an 85-year-old woman named Edith, who welcomed me as if I were family. That week, for the first time since September, I could truly breathe. I woke up with the birds singing, swam in the river, helped Edith prepare meals, talked at length about life on the porch while watching the river flow by. My blood pressure dropped, My heart calmed. My mind was finally able to rest. Edith had a deep wisdom that came from decades of living, simply yet fully. One night, sitting under the stars, she told me something that was etched into my soul. She said the pain of betrayal only completely destroys those who allow it to define who they are. That I had done the difficult part. I had exposed the truth and sought justice, but that now I needed to do the even more difficult part, which was to forgive. Not for him, but for myself. To forgive so I could truly move on. I returned to Aiken at the end of that week feeling renewed in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The B&B was running perfectly under the care of Janice and Francis. The guests were satisfied. Reservations kept coming. Everything was going well. I realized that the B&B didn't depend only on me, that I had built something bigger than my individual self. March brought unexpected news. Manny called me saying George wanted a meeting, mediated by him, to discuss the final terms of the divorce and the restitution of the embezzled amounts. My first instinct was to refuse, to say I had nothing to talk about with that man. But Janice convinced me that it would be important for the definitive closure of this phase of my life. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Manny's office. I spent the entire morning nervous, changing clothes 3 times, unable to concentrate on any task. Janice offered to go with me, but I refused. This was something I needed to face alone. When I walked into the office and saw George sitting on the other side of the table, I barely recognized him. He had aged years in just a few months. His hair was completely white. His face had deep wrinkles that weren't there before. His eyes had lost that confident spark he always carried. He was thin, hunched, the perfect image of defeat. Manny conducted the meeting professionally, presenting the terms of the agreement. George accepted everything without question. He would sign the definitive transfer of the B&B to me, renouncing any rights to the property. He would sell the car and some investments he still possessed to begin repaying the credit union. He would agree to all legal penalties without appeal. When the bureaucratic part ended, Manny discreetly left the room, leaving us alone for a few minutes. The silence was heavy, loaded with decades of history and months of destruction. It was George who finally spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. He apologized, not with the empty, rehearsed words I expected, but with a brutal honesty that caught me off guard. He said he had destroyed the best thing he ever had in life out of pride and stupidity. That door never meant anything compared to what we had built, that he spent every night regretting every wrong choice, every lie, every moment he chose betrayal instead of honesty. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he knew he didn't deserve it, but that he needed me to know the fault wasn't mine, that I had always been a wonderful wife, an incredible woman, and that he was just an idiot who took 48 years to realize the treasure he had and lost everything in 4 years of moral blindness. I looked at that broken man in front of me and, for the first time, didn't feel anger or pain. I felt only a profound sadness for the waste of everything that could have been. I took a deep breath and told him exactly how I felt. I said he was right. The fault wasn't mine, that I had been the best wife I could be, and that now I was discovering how to be the best version of myself without him. April arrived bringing a transformation I could barely believe. The B&B was unrecognizable, not just physically, but in its essence. Janice had a commercial vision I never had, and together we created something that went beyond a simple place for guests to sleep. We transformed the space into a true Southern charm cultural experience point, offering not just accommodation but authentic regional experiences. We hired a young guide named Ray, 28, who knew every trail, every river, every story of the region like no one else. He started taking our guests on personalized tours, showing Appalachian communities, teaching about medicinal plants, telling local legends. Tourists loved it, and the B&B's online reviews soared. Frances revealed an extraordinary talent for regional cooking. We expanded the breakfast to include not just my sweet potato biscuits, but also grits, fried green tomatoes, pecan pie prepared by her. Guests started asking for recipes, asking if they could learn to cook with us. That's when I had the idea to offer Southern comfort cooking classes as an extra activity. The first class took place on a Saturday morning with 5 curious guests. Frances and I taught them to prepare shrimp and grits, explaining every ingredient, telling stories about shrimp fishing, the importance of the dish to local communities. The participants had so much fun that they posted photos and videos on social media, and within a week we had requests from people in other cities wanting to participate. But it wasn't all sunshine. In May, I received an unexpected call that chilled my blood. It was a woman who identified herself as Carrie, Dawn's cousin. She said she urgently needed to talk to me about something she had discovered that could change everything I thought I knew about the situation. My first instinct was to hang up, but something in the urgency of her voice made me agree to a meeting. We arranged to meet at a neutral diner downtown. Carrie arrived punctually, a 41-year-old woman, elegant but visibly nervous. She sat across from me and, without preamble, began telling a story that left me stunned. She said Dawn wasn't the only culprit in the betrayal as I imagined, that in fact, everything had been a much more calculated plan than I suspected. According to Carrie, Dawn had a habit of seeking out married men in comfortable financial positions and deliberately seducing them. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. She used these relationships to get expensive gifts, favors, money. But with George, she had gone further. She had found out about his position at the credit union and actively encouraged him to embezzle funds, promising they would build a life together once he saved enough money. Carrie showed me old messages she had managed to recover from Dawn's phone, conversations where she coldly manipulated George, saying she couldn't leave her husband unless she had guaranteed financial security, suggesting specific amounts he should acquire from the credit union. It was proof that George, as guilty as he was, had been manipulated by someone far more calculating. I felt a confusing mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe that this somewhat alleviated George's guilt, but another part knew that he was an adult and responsible for his own choices, regardless of the manipulation. I asked Carrie why she was telling me this. Why betray her own cousin? She answered with tears in her eyes that she couldn't bear to keep that secret anymore. That Dawn had destroyed not just my marriage and her own, but several other families over the years. That she, Carrie, had tried to warn her countless times, but Dawn just laughed and said she was taking advantage of men's naivety, and that now, seeing the real consequences in the lives of innocent people, she couldn't stay silent anymore. That night I talked at length with Janice about the meeting with Carrie. My partner and friend was wise as always. She said that Dawn's level of manipulation didn't lessen George's responsibility, but it did explain some things. And that maybe, eventually, that information would help me find peace. Understanding that he didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy our life, but was gradually led by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The following months brought a stability I hadn't felt in years. The B&B was prospering, my health was improving with the decrease in stress, and I was rediscovering who Carla was beyond being someone's wife. I started participating more actively in the community, helping organize cultural events, giving talks to young entrepreneurs about managing small businesses. In June, during the city's Independence Day celebration, I met a man named Constance, a 67-year-old widower who had recently moved to Aiken. He was a retired history professor, passionate about Southern culture, and started frequenting the B&B for the cooking classes. We talked a lot during the classes, and I discovered we shared many interests. Constance started inviting me for walks at sunset, to watch the sunset at the marina. At first, I resisted, frightened by the idea of allowing anyone to get close emotionally. But Janice encouraged me, saying I deserved a second chance at happiness, that not all men were like George, and that Constance seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person, not as an opportunity. I accepted the first invitation in July, timid and insecure like a teenager. We walked along the boardwalk talking about books, regional history, our lives. He told me about the wife he had lost to illness 3 years prior, about how long it took to feel alive again. I told him about George, the betrayal, how I had needed to destroy my own life to rebuild it better. Constance didn't judge, didn't offer unsolicited advice, just listened with genuine attention. He said I was an extraordinarily strong woman, that he admired my courage to confront the situation instead of pretending it didn't exist. That simple validation meant more to me than he could imagine. The following months were of a growing, comfortable friendship. Constance became a constant presence at the B&B, not just for classes, but helping with small things, fixing a leaky faucet here, painting a wall there. Janice joked that I had found a keeper, but I insisted we were just friends, too scared to consider anything beyond that. It was in August that I received another unexpected piece of news. Manny called me saying George had gotten a job in a small town 5 hours from Aiken, working as an administrative assistant at a river transport company. The salary was a fraction of what he earned before, but at least he was trying to rebuild his life and pay his debts. He had started making monthly deposits to the credit union, small but regular amounts. The news brought me contradictory feelings. Part of me was satisfied to know he was taking responsibility. Another part simply no longer cared, as if he were a stranger whose life didn't affect me. I realized that indifference was, in fact, a sign of healing. I was finally letting go of the past. In September, exactly 1 year after discovering the receipt for the emerald necklace, I organized a small celebration at the B&B. Not to celebrate the end of the marriage, but to celebrate the rebirth of Carla. I invited Janice, Francis, Ray, some guests who had become friends, and Constance. We prepared a feast with the best regional dishes and spent the evening talking, laughing, sharing stories. During the celebration, Ted Harrison unexpectedly showed up. He said he had heard about the event and wanted to present me with something special. He handed me an official document from the credit union, declaring that, in recognition of my courage in exposing the irregularities and saving dozens of families from greater losses, I was being named an honorary member of the Fishermen's Credit Union. I was profoundly moved. This meant the community saw me not as the betrayed wife who exposed her husband, but as someone who had done the right thing, even at immense personal cost. It was an acknowledgement that my pain had served a greater purpose, had protected innocent people. But the night held yet another surprise. As the guests began to say goodbye, Constance asked to stay a few minutes longer, said he needed to talk to me. We sat on the porch, in the same place where we used to have coffee with George, but now that space had new meanings, new memories. Constance held my hands delicately and said that over the past few months he had fallen in love with me, that he understood if I wasn't ready, that he would respect any decision I made, but that he needed to be honest about his feelings. He said he saw me as a complete woman, fascinating, strong, and that he would like the chance to make me happy, if I allowed it. My first instinct was to pull back, to say it was too soon, that I was still healing. But then I looked at that gentle, sincere man in front of me and realized something important. I could spend the rest of my life afraid of being betrayed again, building walls around my heart. Or I could choose to trust again, knowing that now I was stronger, wiser, more capable of protecting myself. I took a deep breath and told Constance that I was scared, that I carried deep scars, but that I was also willing to try, that I would need patience, time. Understanding, he smiled with a tenderness that melted me and said he had all the time in the world, that there was no rush, that we could build something at our own pace. That night, lying in bed alone but with a lighter heart than I had in months, I reflected on the journey of the last year. I had lost a 48-year marriage, discovered devastating betrayals, faced serious health problems, publicly exposed the person I loved most. But I had also found strengths I didn't know I possessed, built a solid business partnership, helped protect dozens of families, and started allowing hope to be part of my life again. October brought physical changes to the B&B. Janice and I decided to undertake a major renovation, expanding to include 2 more rooms and a space dedicated to the cooking classes. Constance helped with the planning and even got his hands dirty during the construction. Seeing that sweaty man working alongside Ray, laughing and talking, made me realize how different it was to have someone who chose to be by your side, not out of obligation or appearance, but out of genuine desire. Reservations for the end of the year were already fully booked, and we had a waiting list. The B&B had become a landmark, not just in Aiken, but throughout the entire state. Tourism magazines published articles about us, highlighting not only the quality of the service but the story of overcoming behind the business. I had become, unintentionally, a symbol of feminine resilience in the region. But with the fame came also curious glances and sometimes judgment. Some people said I had been too cruel to George, that I should have resolved everything privately. Others said I had done the right thing, that men like him needed to be exposed. I learned not to care about outside opinions, to focus only on what truly mattered, my inner peace and my purpose. In November, during a night walk with Constance along the boardwalk, he suddenly stopped, looked at me with those gentle eyes, and asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I was silent for a few seconds, truly reflecting on the answer, and then I realized with surprise and gratitude that yes, I was happy, not in the way I had imagined being happy when I was young, not with the fairy tale I was promised, but with a happiness built on solid foundations of self-knowledge, purpose, and genuine freedom.